And now, please welcome our keynote speaker. He's a best-selling author, the editor-in-chief of Daily Wire, and host of The Ben Shapiro Show. A round of applause for Ben Shapiro.
How's it going, y'all? Love you too, dude. All right, so, well, I got to admit, I don't know why any of you are here. It's a really nice day outside. I mean, like, you're in California. This isn't the East Coast, so you really have no excuse. I have an excuse for being here. I have to be here. I don't know why you're here. But let's talk a little bit about your rights and why they're under assault. And I promise you that we're going to do a big Q&A because, frankly, I'm more interested in doing Q&A than I am in hearing myself talk today. I'm sorry, it's a Sunday. I'm very grumpy, as you can tell. But I'll talk for a little while, and then we can do some Q&A, and that'll be a little bit more fun. And when we get to the Q&A, my rule stands that I have at colleges, which is that if you raise your hand and you disagree with me, then you go to the front of the line, which is what makes for fun. So today, let's start by talking about your freedoms and why they are under assault. So your freedoms are under assault from motivated thinkers on every side. You have a group of people who believe that because there are problems in your life or in their life, that they get to assault other people's rights, and they get to redistribute the product of your labor. They get to invade your rights on behalf of their own. And the most extreme version of this is the identity politics that has suddenly infused large portions of the left. It's actually generated a sort of response politics of identity politics on behalf of the right. But this basic logic suggests that because you are a member of a particular victimized group in American society, other people's rights don't matter the same way that your rights matter. And what this creates on the part of the left is the intersectional hierarchy. This idea that if you're a member of a more victimized group, you have more rights by nature than people who are members of less victimized groups, because we have to somehow rectify the imbalances of America's history. So on the intersectionality scale, for the left, it goes something like this in terms of the folks who are most victimized in American society. It goes LGBT folks, and then black folks, and then Hispanics, and then women, and then Asians, and then Jews, and then right here at the bottom, white folks. And this matters because for the left, this identity politics hierarchy decides how seriously we ought to take your views. If you are lower on the intersectional politics hierarchy, then we don't have to take your view particularly seriously. In fact, you should shut up and you should listen. You should acknowledge your privilege. If you are at the upper end of that echelon, then of course, you should be able to not only say whatever you want, but you should also be respected for what you have to say, no matter how stupid it is. And if your rights are violated and you're on the bottom end of that scale, well, that's just because that's the way the world has to work in order to fix the problems that we've had historically in the country. Well, to understand the current assault on individual rights that's taking place across the country, we first have to understand that there are two different visions of how rights work. There's the negative rights vision, and there's the positive rights vision. The negative rights vision suggests that rights come from God. You, as an individual human being, have rights that you would have in a state of nature, without a government present, without any sort of overarching power. You would have these rights. You have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to your own property. You have the right to freedom of speech. You have the right to bear arms. All of these things exist in a state of nature because they allow you to protect yourselves and own what it is that you do. These are rights that come as a manifestation of you being an individual of worth, of you being made in God's image. Then there's the positive rights view of how rights work. And this is the idea that rights come from government. There are no rights outside of government. There's a big collective. And that collective gets to tell you what your rights are. And therefore, if that collective decides that your rights are not as important as somebody else's rights, then they can simply redistribute the rights. They can circumscribe the rights. They can prevent those rights from being evenly applied or available to everyone. The US Constitution is based on negative rights. The Constitution of South Africa, or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, those are based on positive rights. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, suggests, the notorious RBG, she says the US Constitution is a worse constitution than the South African Constitution because she is a devotee of positive rights. This would be right to health care, right to education, right to housing. Now, the way you can tell the difference between a negative right and a positive right, just in practice, is whether a right that is articulated requires somebody else's labor or time in order to effectuate. So I have a right to bear arms. That doesn't require anything of you. I have a right to self-defense, freedom of speech. I have a right to my own property. These require nothing of you other than you don't get to invade that right. A right to housing, by contrast, suggests that I have to provide you housing. A right to health care suggests I have to provide you health care. And that if I am unwilling to provide you these things, then I have violated the social compact and I can be forced to at the point of gun. You can see how these differences between negative and positive rights are manifest in today's politics. And it's no surprise that the Constitution has come under attack from these positive rights advocates, largely springing from the left. Now, how do these positive rights intersect with the identity politics I was talking about early? Well, the left has basically suggested that positive rights are not to be equally applied. It's not that everybody has a right to housing or everybody has a right to health care. It's that everybody has a right to housing and everybody has a right to health care. And if we have to restrict somebody else's rights in order to guarantee that universal positive right, then we will pick the groups that have historically benefited from the American system, and we will penalize those groups. So identity politics is really a redistributionist way of thinking about how rights are supposed to be manifest in American politics. Here's how all of this plays out in terms of your rights. The Bill of Rights is filled with rights. These are all negative rights. All of the rights in the Bill of Rights, with possible exception of right to counsel, maybe. All of these are negative rights. They are rights that you have in a state of nature and that are not guaranteed to you by the government, except by the government guaranteeing nobody else can invade those rights. And all of those rights are currently under assault from a left that wishes to rewrite that social compact. Freedom of religion, under the First Amendment, obviously is being assaulted right now by folks who believe that rights are variable. And freedom of religion suggests that I get to practice my religion as I see fit, so long as I'm not harming you. But what the left does is they say, well, your definition of harm isn't broad enough. So if you run a business and you don't wish to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, you are somehow invading my rights. Well, I'm not. In any sort of negative rights world, I'm obviously not invading your rights because I have no obligation to bake you a cake. It's my cake, it's my shop. I don't have a right to, you don't have a right to my cake. You don't have a right to my labor, you don't have a right to my time. But the left has decided that freedom of religion must be quashed, but specifically religions that have had historical dominance in the United States, which is one of the reasons that you see all of this focus on the part of social activists on the left, focusing in on religious Christians and almost none focusing on religious Muslims, for example. If you go to a religious Muslim bakery, they also will probably tell you that they're not interested in baking a cake for your same-sex wedding. But you haven't seen any talk about that, specifically because Muslims in the United States rank higher on the intersectional scale than Christians do. Well, the same thing holds true when it comes to rights like freedom of speech and of the press. The right to freedom of speech only applies under certain circumstances according to the left, because some speech is harmful, some speech is violence. Hate speech must be banned. Now, nothing in the Constitution says any of this. Speech is speech, violence is violence. There is no such category under the Constitution, or really in thought, as hate speech. We all know that there's such a thing as hateful speech, but that's not the same thing as saying that you, a subjective human being, get to ban other people or use violence to stop other people from talking. Yet you see that the left has engaged in a sort of mob politics where they grin and laugh when people's rights are shut down. If I go to Berkeley, then you'll see riots, literal riots, if I go to Berkeley, because my speech is violence. When I went to Berkeley, requiring some 500 police officers, 600 police officers to protect the place, people outside were literally chanting, speech is violence, which of course it is not. But if the goal is to equate speech with violence, then as soon as speech is violence, we can shut down violence. Government has a role in preventing violence. So if my speech is violence or causes violence, then we can simply shut down my speech. This is ugly stuff. And you see, unfortunately, this mindset becoming quite prominent across the country. I'm not just talking about governmental attempts to shut down speech at this point. I'm talking about an attitude of free speech that actually allows us to have a fulsome conversation about the issues. You saw this manifest when it came to the Me Too movement. This idea that men had nothing to say about Me Too. Sit down and shut up, you're men, you don't know anything. Or abortion, sit down and shut up, you're men, you don't know anything. Well, we can't have a conversation if you're simply going to assume that I can't understand you because of dint of birth. I was born a man, not my fault. I mean, I'll say I'm pretty happy about it, but it doesn't actually mean that I can't have an opinion on matters that affect other groups more than they affect me. Because the entire basis of having any sort of republic is the idea that we can talk beyond those barriers, that we can have rational conversations with one another. Identity politics throws up a roadblock in the way of this. Identity politics prevents you from having these important conversations. The left is assaulting the right to bear arms, obviously. Now, the right to bear arms was specifically created and meant to protect you from tyranny. It wasn't meant for hunting. It wasn't meant for sport shooting. It was meant to protect you from tyranny and to prevent you from having your rights assaulted in your own home. The left has decided, however, that that's not really a threat, which leads to a really weird spectacle. The left proclaims that President Trump is Hitler or Stalin, but they want him to take all their guns, which is a very weird response to Hitler or Stalin. The fact is that if the left truly believed that Trump was all the things they say that he is, they would be very much in favor of the right to bear arms as a defense against the sort of tyranny that they specifically are afraid of. But the real truth is that the attempt to take away the right to bear arms is based on the idea that your individual rights can be quashed in the name of the collective, that there is a broader collective that has an interest in you not having a gun, and therefore your gun should be taken away, no matter how law-abiding you are, which is one of the weird things about gun control. Everybody, left, right, and center, agrees. We don't want people with severe mental illness having guns. We don't want people with criminal records having guns. We don't want people who are inherently dangerous having guns. It's only the left that suggests we want people who are fully law-abiding to have their guns taken away from them because somehow this is going to make society safer, which suggests perhaps there's an ulterior motive to the attempt to take away the right to bear arms, and that is to remove obstacles between the government's control of human life and your rights. Other elements of the Constitution that are being undermined right now, other rights that are being undermined. The most obvious case in the last several weeks, obviously, is due process of law. The British government violated the rights of colonists without due process of law on a regular basis. Now, all due process of law means is that there is a fair legal system that allows adjudication of your rights and defense of those rights. And due process of law requires that you be treated as an individual. Due process requires that your rights are yours. In other words, if you are an individual and you didn't do anything wrong, you don't get to be thrown in jail based on what group you're a part of. And yet we saw, actually, over the last several weeks, that the left has basically decided that this is to no longer apply based on your membership in particular groups. We saw this specifically with Brett Kavanaugh. When due process of law, the very concept of it went by the wayside. The most obvious example that I saw in terms of public discourse was this grand attempt by the nation's op-ed papers to print piece after piece from women who'd been sexually assaulted, claiming that their sexual assault meant that Brett Kavanaugh was guilty. Connie Chung wrote a piece like this for the Washington Post, in which she talked about how, as a 20-year-old woman, she was sexually assaulted by her doctor. And she said, "I believe Christine Blasey Ford because I was sexually assaulted when I was 20. Well, I'm curious. You, who are not Christine Blasey Ford, was sexually assaulted by a man who was not Brett Kavanaugh, and therefore Brett Kavanaugh assaulted Christine Blasey Ford. This does not follow. If we are going to start condemning people or removing due process of law or burden of proof or presumption of innocence simply on the basis of your identity, your genetic identity, it's very weird to see the same left that recognized that this was a bad thing when it came to race in the 1960s suddenly suggest that it is okay when it comes to sex in the 2010s. Due process of law is the fundamental heart of our civilization, and removing that on the basis of identity politics is dangerous stuff. Obviously, the most obvious example of a right being removed based on identity is the right to life. And this notion that you get to simply adjudicate based on your own subjective feelings about whether you want to have a baby, whether a baby is indeed a baby, is just a complete violation of logic and law and common sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. If you want to actually make a pro-choice argument, then make a pro-choice argument, but that argument cannot be based on a woman has better judgment about what constitutes life than a man, and that a society that tries to protect individual human lives has no stake in what happens to the unborn. That obviously is a bad argument. Unfortunately, all of these arguments have become quite commonplace in America right now, and that means all of these rights are in serious danger. And one of the reasons these rights are in serious danger, too, is because when you have a society that is focused only on rights and not at all on virtues, it turns out that there's a backlash. And this has been part of the problem. And this is a problem for people on the right. I'm not even talking about people who are not really on the right, like the idiotic alt-right. I'm not talking about folks on the right who don't actually believe in conservative principles. I'm talking about the libertarian-minded right, folks like me. There's been a problem. We talk about rights all the time, and that's good, because we should talk about rights and how to defend them. But because we very rarely talk about the virtues that are necessary to preserve freedom and preserve a free people, we end up generating a backlash to the right itself. So, for example, the right is very pro-capitalism. Right? All of that is great. I'm a virulently free market individual. But in order for free markets to actually operate the way they are supposed to, you require a virtuous and decent people. You require people who are going to abide by certain basic social rules. You require people who have enough respect for each other that they're not trying to cheat each other at every turn, who have enough respect for each other and the social fabric, they're not trying to tear each other apart in the name of short-term gain. You need a virtuous people. Because otherwise what happens is that bad things happen in the name of capitalism, and then the left responds by saying, capitalism is no good, we need social control from the top. You see the same thing happen with regard to freedom of speech. I will defend anybody's freedom of speech, including from people who disagree with me, who threaten me, who are legitimately awful human beings. But if we are constantly using freedom of speech in the worst possible ways, you're going to see a backlash, an inevitable backlash on the part of people who have not thought about the relationship between rights and responsibilities and think that we ought to quash the right in order to make a better world. That's dangerous stuff. And so it's incumbent on all of us to become more virtuous in how we speak. And that's me too, right? I've failed at this. We all fail at this. But the question is, which direction are we moving? Can we make ourselves more virtuous? Can we have conversations with other people without assuming the worst motives and the worst intent? When it comes to the right to bear arms, are we going to be responsible about how we treat our weaponry? Are we going to be responsible in getting trained? Are we going to make sure that the guns are locked up? If you actually want to have good conversations while maintaining rights, then what you need is a people who are committed to a certain baseline of morality. Due process of law means thinking beyond our confirmation bias, requiring due process of law whether we like the person who is being attacked or whether we don't like the person who's being attacked. We actually have to think through each individual case. If we make ourselves better, then we deserve our rights. We have those rights whether we deserve them or not. And the solution to misuse of rights is not to quash the right. But if we actually wish to be a free people who preserve our own rights, then we have to be a more virtuous people. And that's the other half of the equation. Every right has corresponding duties. Not duties on somebody else's behalf. That's positive rights. Duties on your own behalf. You have a right to free speech. That means you have the obligation to think well and speak well. You have the right to property. That means that you ought to treat people responsibly and make moral decisions with that property. That doesn't mean we can take away your right, but if you want a functioning society, you need rights on the one hand and virtues on the other. And if they go hand in hand, then you have a functioning, beautiful country. That's, I think, what we all ought to be aiming for, right, left, and center. Okay, happy to take your questions. And again, the rule is that if you disagree and you raise your hand, go to the front of the line. And I'll take it on faith that you're actually doing this, not just to get to the front of the line.
Hi, Ben. How's it going? My name is Jesse, and I wanted to ask you about Spanish language mainstream conservative media. So at this point in 2018, we still have over 41 million Spanish speakers all across the United States, second only to Mexico in terms of Spanish-speaking population worldwide, 15 million in California. And yet we still don't have any kind of conservative media in Spanish on any kind of mainstream or even alternative media basis. There's only very disparate YouTube channels or Facebook pages or what have you. And when I was wondering two things. One is, why is this still the case? Second, I was wondering if you and Daily Wire would be interested in being able to make a shift in the culture and a shift in our country and being pioneers in this venture. And I was wondering if I could partner with you. I grew up as a Christian missionary in Lima, Peru, in South America. So I'm a U.S. citizen, grew up overseas, dual citizen of U.S. and Peru. I'm fully bilingual in English and Spanish, also in French as well, because I was Michigan and French.
Yeah, the answer to your question is absolutely send us a resume. Conservatism is not limited to one language. And when I spoke at the California Republican Party, I gave the keynote address to the California convention. It was probably 5 years ago. I actually suggested that everybody in the room ought to try learning Spanish. I'm working on it right now. I've been working on it for years. I keep failing. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be reaching out in other languages. So yeah, send us a resume, absolutely. It's bshapiro@dailywire.com.
Okay, can I drop this off on the stage? Can I give
Well, yeah, that's fine. Just drop it at the front of the stage. That's fine. Cool. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
All right, hi, Ben. So I definitely lean to the left, but I really appreciate what you do for free speech.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it when folks on the left show up.
I listen to your show almost daily.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. So anyway, so my question is, since the 1970s, we've seen polarization steadily increase. Obviously, right now with Maxine Waters and Horseface, it's pretty difficult to come to a more moderate politics. But if it's possible to come to a more moderate politics in the next few decades, how would you see that happening?
I mean, I think that the way that this is going to happen is people are going to get so ticked with each other that eventually they're going to say the only way we get to live together in a society is to leave each other alone. This is why I have a lot of hope for sort of the future of the libertarian movement, not the party, because the party's a joke, but the movement itself. I'm sorry, to those of you who are members of the Libertarian Party, you had a naked guy prancing around with an iron cross at your convention. You got nothing. But with that said, I think what the left can learn from President Trump is that they don't want President Trump running their life, and I think what the right has learned anew from Barack Obama is they didn't want Barack Obama running their life, which means devolution of authority to the lowest possible level. That's the only way we're going to be able to handle living in the same country with one another, because if it's just a battle over who gets to control whose life, then we have a real problem on our hands. And so I think that you're seeing people come together around that, although I think that's easier said than done in the social sphere than the economic sphere, because the left particularly is fascinated with the idea of being able to manipulate economics from the top for a different distribution of wealth. And that, I think, is a terrible idea. I think, again, the only way you're going to have a functioning society is if we leave each other alone, basically. Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. As a thing you like, you recommended that people read Economics in One Lesson.
Yeah, by Henry Hazlitt, yeah.
Right, that basically says that because of the broken window fallacy, government spending isn't great for the economy. So my question for you is war good for the economy? And if so, is it good because of government defense spending? And how does that impact your thoughts on whether World War II ended the Great Depression?
So war is not good for the economy. War is very bad for the economy. It's a misallocation of resources toward breaking things and bombing people that could be used in other ways, obviously. As far as whether World War II ended the Great Depression, only in terms of unemployment, meaning that it was really the return from, if you take 200,000 people out, well, 200,000, if you take millions of people out of the workforce immediately and start paying them money from future spending, then there will be an immediate boost in the employment rate. I mean, a bunch of people who are unemployed now have jobs. That doesn't necessarily mean that the economy is getting a lot stronger. In the aftermath of World War II, with the rest of the world fundamentally destroyed, that gave us an enormous market for us to export to, basically. There were an enormous number of countries who needed to buy our stuff and who required our stuff. And that new export market, combined with men returning from war and capital enthusiasm for getting back involved in the economy, meant a lot. Also, there was some deregulation that happened after World War II. There was heavy regulation during World War II itself. In fact, Hazlitt leads off the beginning of his book basically by saying people think war is good for the economy. War is not good for the economy. It creates a short-term boost in spending, which looks like it's good for the economy, but it doesn't lead to any underlying significant growth in economic prosperity or in the creation of new products and services that make our lives better, because people tend to equate unemployment rate with good economy. That's not true. The USSR had a 100% employment rate and a crappy economy. Cuba has a 100% employment rate and a crappy economy. What makes economies good is the number of goods and services that are life-changing, powerful, and widely available that make our lives better. That's why your life is better now than it was in the 1970s.
Hi, you're a hard man to reach to. I'm glad I made it today. My name's Felix. I have a question for you about healthcare.
All right.
I disagree with you on this issue. We spend more on per capita than any other country in the world and have some of the worst results. According to the World Health Organization, we were 37th in 2000, 49th in 2009, and 50th in 2010. We also lead in mortality amenable to healthcare with over 45,000 people that will die every year because of it. The top 17 countries, and I have the list right here, that have the best healthcare in the world uses some form of universal healthcare, whether that be single payer or two-tiered system or a government mandated program. I am curious to know why you continue to deny that universal healthcare is an effective system. And before you answer the question, I personally would advocate for a two-tiered system, not single payer.
Okay, so the answer is that it depends on what you're going for. Really, it does. So there's a couple reasons. Well, let me put it this way. Here's the framework that I use when I'm thinking about healthcare. Before that, just organizing my thoughts here. Before that, the first thing to mention is that all of the countries that are doing really well on healthcare also were doing well on healthcare before the implementation of a nationalized healthcare system. It's not the national healthcare system that changed Sweden into a healthy country or Norway into a healthy country. These were healthy countries before that happened. That's just the way it is. The United States is mainly unhealthy because we eat a bunch of shit here, right? I mean, that really is the reason. Our diet is really different than it is in, for example, Japan or in Norway, where people tend to exercise more and are healthier as an overall metric. So comparing populations is not like, it depends on where you're comparing. If you compare Norwegians in the United States to people who live in Norway, my guess is you probably wouldn't see an enormous difference in the level of health care obtained. Number two, the United States healthcare system is a disaster area. It's actually the worst of all possible worlds. It is not a free market system, and it's not a totally regulated system. It's somewhere in between, which means it's heavily regulated and heavily subsidized, which leads to increased costs. That's why it's so expensive. When we say that we're spending an enormous amount per capita, we should define who the we is. The we is not the government. The we is the government plus private expenditures on healthcare. Now, it's my decision whether I want to spend a lot of money on end-of-life care. It's my decision whether I want to spend a lot of money on immediate care. So it's not quite a one-to-one ratio the way that people are making it out to be. And that's why in the United States, for example, when it comes to 5-year cancer survival rates, we actually rank number 1 in the world. That's because you actually have availability of healthcare if you can pay for it. The question is, how do you bring the cost down? So now to my model of how I think about healthcare. Dan McLaughlin in National Review puts it this way. He says you can have 3 things in healthcare. You can have affordability, universality, and quality. Those are the 3 things that you're looking for in healthcare. Every system can guarantee no better than 2. So most of the systems that you're talking about, if they are universal, they are not affordable in the sense that the government does rack up enormous surcharges on that basis. Now, that may not be as much as we're spending here, because as I say, we have the worst of all available systems. We're not free market and we're not nationalized. But Canada's healthcare system is extraordinarily expensive. Britain's healthcare is extraordinarily expensive. Norway's healthcare is extraordinarily expensive, which is why the tax rates on people in the middle class and lower classes is still exorbitantly high. Like, the United States actually has a far more progressive system of taxation than Switzerland or Sweden or Norway. Right? All of those countries have income taxes of 60% for folks making about 60 grand a year. It's really, really high. There is a cost to it. Now, the question is, what are you looking for? So what I am looking for is affordability and quality and not universality. Universal health care is good if you're looking for universality. If you're looking for universality and affordability, you don't spend a lot of money in your ration health care. You see some single-payer systems that are like this. If you're looking for universality and quality, then you don't care that much about affordability. You just spend an awful lot of money on it. And if you're looking for quality and affordability, then you have a free market system, because that's what free markets generate. They can generate near universality, but not complete universality. This is true for food products, for example. It's not true that everyone has equal access to food, but food is extraordinarily cheap in the United States and very high quality, at least what you can get. So the question is, how do you wish to define the balance between rights and duties in a civilized society? My answer is I want affordability and quality, and I want social fabric picking up the rest, particularly at local level and hopefully before you get to the governmental level. The problem I have with the universal healthcare system is that it tends to drive down supply of doctors and nurses unless you spend exorbitant amounts of cash, right? You have to import people from other countries to do that work. This is what's happened in Britain, where they're importing a lot of their healthcare system from India, for example. Or you have to spend enormous sums of money. So are there nationalized healthcare systems that are better than ours? Yeah, there are. Australia is better than ours. Switzerland is better than ours. And I agree with you. If you were going to do this, you would want a 2-tiered system, right? Which is more like Switzerland. But in my view, the best of all available systems would be a wild deregulation of the healthcare system itself, leading to lowered costs, higher quality, and then what's left over can be filled in with relatively minimal investment.
Just one thing. Can I email you with some responses?
Sure,
All
absolutely.
Right.
Thanks. Love you too.
Good afternoon, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
My question is on Marbury v. Madison and
Yeah.
judicial review. Would this be your primary argument against Roe v. Wade, that it was passed and it isn't in the Constitution? And do you think, as a follow-up to this, do you think it would be a better stance for social conservatives to take a libertarian approach, to say that you're against abortion for the moral reasons, but that you would support it if it was passed through the states?
No.
The House?
So when it comes to Marbury versus Madison and the place of judicial review, I don't like judicial review as a basic element of the system. I think it's quite controversial whether Marbury versus Madison was correctly decided in the first place, because I don't think that the founders meant to create a super legislature of people who are the wisest and best among us to decide what the Constitution means. It's still kind of hotly contested in conservative legal circles whether judicial review is a thing. When it comes to abortion, the chief argument I have against Roe v. Wade on a constitutional level is that nowhere in the Constitution does it say there's a right to abortion, because there is no right to abortion in the actual Constitution of the United States. In fact, there's not anything even remotely approaching a right to abortion in the Constitution of the United States. However, when it comes to my moral stance on this, I'm not libertarian on abortion in the same way that I would not be libertarian on slavery. So in 1856, there was a very widespread debate in the United States between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas basically took the decentralized position on slavery. He said states should be able to decide for themselves whether or not they wish to preserve slavery or not. Why is it my business? It's not my state, it's not my life. The same argument could easily be made about abortion. Why is it my business? It's not my body, it's not my life, it's not my child. So, if a state decides to be liberal about abortion, well, that's their business. If you believe that human life is being violated on a fundamental level by abortion itself, you cannot stand idly by and then kick it to states for a libertarian cause. I'm fine with libertarianism on causes that do not involve a violation of the most basic right, the right to live. That is not something where I'm willing to devolve that to the lowest level, the same way I'm not willing to suggest that any state that does not prosecute murder would be allowed to do that under the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States does not allow a state to simply say that murder is no longer a thing, or slavery is fine. I'm not going to pretend that this is an issue on which libertarianism has anything to say. In fact, you can be a pro-life libertarian simply by saying that there is a fundamental right to life that ought to be protected for those who are unborn. I like the shirt.
Thank you. I thought you'd dig it. The first time I see a Sarah Press is overrated shirt will be a very great day. So a lot of people, especially here, feel like you're just a fantastic debater, destroyer of liberals and their arguments. And that's not something I've actually seen a lot in practice. I've seen you out-debate college students. Ooh. So I've seen you out-debate college students, but, they're college students. If you were debating 19-year-old you, I have no question that 19-year-old you would get absolutely destroyed. And I see you have kind of fireside chit-chats with, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson. Oh.
It's fine, Go ahead.
And you're not really debating them in a substantial way either. They have differences of opinions, but I think you more focus on where you agree than where you disagree. So my question is, A, if this is correct, and there are some exceptions like the Politicon debate last year, why do you think this is? Are liberals afraid to debate you? Are you afraid to debate them? Are there a lot of examples of really great head-to-head debates that I'm just missing?
Sure, yeah. I mean, if you go back there, I did a series of debates in Seattle with a group of folks, the local head of the NAACP, the writer for the Seattle Stranger on race. We did a debate with some gun experts on gun rights. I've literally spent my entire life, my political life, having conversations with folks on the left. In fact, those are the conversations that I enjoy the most. As far as why there are all these tapes of me destroying liberals at college campuses, it's because college students apparently have more courage than a lot of professional political pundits who don't actually want to get on a stage. I've invited an inordinate number of folks on the left onto the Sunday special, specifically because I actually prefer, as opposed to the debate format, the discussion format, because it allows you to get a little bit deeper. Right? Debate formats themselves are built for how do you destroy the other side, how do you undermine a point, right? And that's fun. I don't think it's necessarily the most productive conversation. And as you see, like when somebody gets up and they ask about nationalized healthcare, I'm happy to have a conversation back and forth in a substantive way about healthcare, looking at the different priorities and how they reflect. And in fact, if you actually go back and you watch all the speeches that I've made on college campuses, I would say that there are many more exchanges of me talking with somebody on the left in a respectful manner than there are tapes of me, quote unquote, destroying anybody. Those are the ones that people like to watch because they're more fun, but that doesn't mean that's what's actually happening on a daily basis. Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Sorry, just for one quick follow-up, I do agree with you on the point that a lot of liberal pundits are, for whatever reason, afraid to debate you. So my follow-up question was going to be, under what circumstances would you, although I'm not a famous liberal pundit, ever be open to having a substantial, long-form, civil conversation with me?
I mean, I'm more than happy to have one if we can both carve out the time and I'm not losing money in doing it. Right? This is the reality, is that I only have so much time in my life, and I've spent a lot of it talking with people. This is what my law school and college experience was about, talking with folks on the left. I have friends on the left who I speak with on a regular basis. I don't want to name names for fear of ruining their careers, but those conversations largely do happen behind closed doors. But people have a fear of getting out in front of a camera, specifically because we do live in an environment where the rock'em sock'em robot stuff tends to get more attention than the substantive discussion stuff.
Hi, I'm Nuance Bro. I have a question about your position on the Iraq War, because you have in the past, written articles about it, and I think even today you still say that you're in support of the Iraq War. So my question is, well, in the article that you wrote in 2005, you wrote that it's important to spread democracy and that empire is a duty, not a choice. And you said it would be good to put democracy into Iraq, but when you did your Islamic radical video and you picked all these different populations saying how radicalized they are, is it necessarily a good idea to democratize these areas and have them vote kind of like they did in the Gaza Strip and then elected Hamas?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think that I've become a lot more realist on this issue. No, I totally, I still think that the Iraq War didn't have to go how the Iraq War went, and I think that pulling out precipitously from Iraq was a huge foreign policy blunder on the part of the Obama administration, that if you actually wanted to form a more stable and lasting state there, you really did have to stay there for a longer period of time. I also am in agreement with the general hawkish foreign policy view that you can't run from the world and then expect the world to stay at your border. That's not the way that this works. With that said, I'm a lot less sanguine, I think, than I was in 2005 about the possibilities of implanting democracy in places like Iraq, when there was a lot of hope about that. You know, I still think that there's a possibility, but it's not something that's going to take root overnight. I think there are a lot of us who are too optimistic about the possibility of that in 2005.
Hi, Ben. I am a fan, but I'm in the disagree category.
Well, that's fine, okay.
There are studies which show young children find black babies dirty or not nice, and that culturally black names on resumes and job applications get fewer callbacks. Do you think this is an example of systematic racism?
Well, I'm not going to accuse a 3-year-old of systematic racism. So let's start with that. I don't think that babies necessarily have the capacity to build an entire hierarchy of race. Like, I have a 4.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and they can barely clean themselves. And the 2.5-year-old can't clean himself. So if he's a racist, I have yet to see it manifest, and he's not like burning a tiny cross in the front yard or anything. As far as, you know, as far as the studies that show the culturally black names being hired at a lesser rate, there's actually a fascinating study that was done about last names. So the question when it came to the first name study was, are people being ruled out because of race, or are they being ruled out because of perception of culture? And this makes a difference because you have what Thomas Sowell calls discrimination, and then he basically has discrimination A and discrimination 1A, and then he has discrimination B. So discrimination B is open racism. You're black, I'm not hiring you because I think you're inferior, right? That's, everyone can agree is racist. Discrimination 1, right, which is basically the idea that I discriminate in my daily life between any number of choices. I'm going to discriminate today about whether I feel like having a hamburger or whether I feel like having a cheese sandwich. It doesn't have any moral content to the discrimination. And then Sowell talks about discrimination 1A. And this is where you don't have the information about the individual necessary to make a highly specific decision about that individual. So instead, you use the best group indicators available. So for example, he uses the example of criminal record. President Obama in office tried to pass a regulation, that the federal government could not, and federal contractors could not in hiring take into account previous criminal record. What this resulted in was the hiring of fewer black people, because as it turns out, a bunch of employers, instead of looking at the individual criminal record of the person who's sitting in front of them, simply said, okay, well, there's a better shot that this black guy in front of me is a criminal than the white guy in front of me, just by looking at the criminality rates or jail rates, right, previous criminal history rates in the two communities. Now, is that racism, or is that discrimination 1B, which is operating in the absence of individual information? I would say that's more discrimination 1B. That's operating in the absence of individual information. Sowell agrees. That's why he uses that term. Now, the reason that that matters with regard to the name study is because what the name study is it's an attempt to use culture as a stand-in for race. So what it is, okay, if I have somebody who has a quote-unquote culturally black name, right, which is to suggest that they maybe come from a neighborhood that is more impoverished, they may come from a culture that is less focused on certain priorities, then I'm going to use that as the stand-in for race. Now, that may be bad. Instead, what we would prefer is to look instead at the specifics of the resume. But there's another study that was done, and this sort of shows the converse, right? And that was, they looked at last names of black folks, like historically black last names. They looked at last names like Johnson, and what they saw was that if you actually just use historically black last names, there was no discrimination at all. So if you put the historically black names, last names, on resumes, and you sent them in, and you put historically white last names, or Jewish last names, Greenstein or something, on a resume, they would get hired at precisely the same rates, because people were actually using the name as a stand-in for information they felt that they did not have. It wasn't that they were instead suggesting, okay, all black people are out. So that's kind of fascinating. This is not to suggest that there's no racism in American life. There certainly is, but we have to point to specific instances of racism and be very exact about where we're accusing people of racism and where we're simply accusing people of using the best information possible. And if the only information that's possible that they are using is group information, we have to make a better effort as a society to ensure that people can get better individualized information so they can judge on the basis of individual identity as opposed to group identity.
So it could be discrimination, but not racism.
Right.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. My name is Neil. I'm a student at USC. And my question is, do you know what smart guns are? And if you do, would you be in favor of them as a way to reduce gun violence in the
So, I mean, as far as regulating people to use smart guns, like forcing people to use smart guns?
No, definitely not.
But just as an option?
Yeah, I just have
So my understanding of smart guns is that they're not quite as reliable yet as they need to be in order for you to use them properly. Like, it's the middle of the night, somebody breaks into your house, your hands are sweaty, you grab the smart gun, it doesn't operate. And this has been, according to at least the gun experts that I've talked to, one of the problems with smart guns. If it did work, right, if it were reliable technology, it'd be the first thing that I would buy, seriously, because I have young kids in my house. Now, my guns are safe. They're in a gun safe, right? And my kids don't have the code. They don't have the combination or anything. And we keep our guns, obviously, like they're in a gun safe, and we make sure that they are not properly loaded. So, you know, there's no possibility of anything happening. But would I much prefer to have quicker access to a gun that's more reliable? Sure, that'd be great. But I don't think the technology is quite there yet.
Hello, I'm Sean. I'm a part of YAF at my UCR university, and I take a very libertarian stance on drugs, including hard drugs. Portugal, for example, has had a major drug problem during the 80s, and it wasn't until when they decriminalized drugs, the number of drug-related deaths have dramatically gone down. So what is your opinion for legalizing all drugs as you are for a non-coercive government?
So, as I've said, I'm for decriminalization of marijuana. I am torn, I'll be honest with you, I'm torn on harder drugs like, for example, heroin, specifically because I am not convinced that the basic argument of libertarianism is that people are capable of making rational decisions about their own lives. One of the problems with addiction and drugs like heroin is that you become utterly incapable of making decisions about your own life. This is one of the problems with severe addiction to hard drugs. And with that said, then the question just becomes efficacy. You know, is it more efficacious to prevent people from getting drugs by legalizing it and heavily regulating it, or is it more efficacious to simply let it out onto the market, or is it more efficacious to ban it outright? And there I'd have to see the evidence on a specific drug and how it was decriminalized properly in a particular society. So I will admit to not having enough information to make a call about some of the harder drugs, but at the very least, something, obviously, and I wish I had better solutions, something has to be done about the opioid epidemic, and I'm not sure that the answer is necessarily decriminalization of opioids in a similar way to decriminalizing marijuana.
Hey Ben, earlier you were talking a lot about the Second Amendment, and my question is, oftentimes I'll hear the argument that the Second Amendment protects the First Amendment. So my question is, why does that seem to not hold true when you look at other countries? For example, if you look at Japan, has almost no guns, but they have a protection for freedom of expression. But for example, if you look at Iraq and in Thailand, they actually have more guns per capita in Thailand and Iraq. Iraq is the sixth highest gun ownership rate in the world, and in Thailand, you see, specifically in the Constitution, you are not allowed to criticize the king. So my question is, why does it seem like you look at these countries like Japan, they don't have any guns, but they have much better freedom of expression. So how does that argument make any sense?
So the argument is basically that a country is built on a specific culture of that country. So I'm not saying that every argument for the Second Amendment in the United States is equally applicable everywhere. Although I will say that the Second Amendment is designed to prevent against ultimate government tyranny, and that is, I think, a fairly universal argument. And the fact that people have not used their guns to protect against government tyranny in some of the places that you're mentioning, that's not the fault of the guns, that's the fault of the people. The bottom line is that one of the reasons that you see the government fearful of violating certain rights is because there is high level of gun ownership in certain areas of America. For example, the reason that the right to bear arms remains pretty solid in the United States is because if the federal government ever contemplated going into Texas and taking away all the guns, things would get really bad really quickly, and the federal government knows that. Sup, y'all?
Hi, I'm Robert Freeman. I'm with Vote Matrix. I'm a tech company. And like you probably know, a lot of tech companies these days are subject to censorship by the government. So I was just wondering how you would balance meeting government regulations and actually hosting an open platform.
So I don't know anything about your company to start. So if it turns out there's something bad about your company later, I literally have never heard of it.
It's not.
But just to make that clear for the cameras and media matters in the room. My view on regulation of tech companies is that I'm pretty well against virtually all of it. I don't think that tech companies should be regulated, and the case that's been made for regulation of tech companies, I think, is fairly weak overall.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Ben. I just want to start off by saying that I'm a big fan of the show, and I listen every day, and you actually inspired me to start my own podcast.
Oh, great. Well, that's great. Thank you.
So thank you. One thing, though, that I'm a little bit concerned about is I would say that you don't have the best track record in terms, so you make the compelling case as to why we have our rights are under attack. You make the compelling case that the left is a threat for what is essentially evil in the United States. Not evil, but for destruction, the destruction of American values. You basically point that out. But then, like for example, in the 2016 election, you're never Trumper. And if Trump was not elected, we would have somebody else to replace Antonin Scalia. We would have had somebody else to replace Justice Kennedy. In cases like the Alabama election, Roy Moore, we saw recently how important it is to have a Senate majority. And most recently in Brett Kavanaugh. You said that if he was guilty of alleged sexual assault at the age of 17 at a drunken high school at a party, that you would say that he is ineligible to be on the Supreme Court. Now, if you truly believe, and like for example in 2008, Heller versus DC, where we were one vote away from misinterpreting the Second Amendment, why would you suggest that we have to forego these clear victories? I think it's a moral mystery of how endangered we are as Americans to lose our rights and to lose this great rhetorical battle between right and left.
So as I said during the 2016 election, if you believe that 2016 is the last election, then you have to vote for Trump, right? If you believe that we're really on the precipice of tyranny and like full tyranny, and that we're never going to have there'll never be any recovery for the country, we're literally at the cliff's point, you have no choice but to vote for the lesser of the two available evils. One of the, what I also said is that, as far as President Trump, number one, I appreciate all the good things that he's done, right? I cheered Gorsuch. I put on a MAGA hat when he picked Gorsuch, right? I've cheered Kavanaugh to a certain extent, although I still would like to see his record on the bench. But when it comes to tax cuts, when it comes to Middle Eastern policy, when it comes to moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, when it comes to taking a harsher stance against Russia, an actual harsher stance, not just words, but actual harsher stance. President Trump's been great. On policy, he's been really, really good in a lot of different ways, and I'm very grateful that he proved me wrong on all that stuff. With all of that said, my main concerns about President Trump were three. Two of those three have been alleviated. One of them has not, and this speaks to Roy Moore. We still need to live in a country together, and as we fall into the trap of saying that every decision is a lesser of two available evils, we are going to start greenlighting worse and worse behavior and worse standards in the name of beating the other guy. And that's what you're seeing with things like Roy Moore. Okay, so Roy Moore, would he have voted for more of my priorities than Doug Jones? Of course he would have. Does it lower the general standard of America to have a credibly accused child molester in the Senate? Yes, of course it does. And if we are not willing to forego some temporary victories in order to preserve the character of the country, if you believe that there is still a social fabric to preserve, then we are contributing to the breakdown of that social fabric. Now, maybe you believe the social fabric is gone, and we're basically at that point. If you believe that, then of course you have to back Roy Moore or whomever, because you're preventing the ultimate evil. This is why while I deeply despise leftist ideology, I think it's a mistake to castigate everybody who's on the political left as an enemy of the United States, or to castigate the press as an enemy of the people, or this kind of stuff. I think it's dangerous stuff because it actually brings us closer to civil war than it does to any sort of cure for what ails the country, even though I deeply disagree with the folks on the left. As far as President Trump in the 2016 election, where I stand for 2020, I had three main concerns with President Trump. One is that President Trump was not going to govern conservatively. That was based on his rhetoric, which was all over the place. He has completely alleviated my concerns on that score. He has governed very, very conservatively, which is terrific. And I'm deeply grateful for it. The second concern that I had was that he was going to soul-suck the Republican Party to the extent that we were going to greenlight a bunch of policies and or character issues that we really didn't like. And there I think I was half right. I mean, you have the party now basically when he says stuff that like the office of the presidency had been previously disgraced by Bill Clinton. It's not a great thing that the president of the United States says horse face, right? I mean, like, these are not wonderful things. And so but my view there is that the damage has sort of already been done, right? He's not doing any worse damage today than he was doing yesterday. He's just being himself, which is like the damage was done the day he entered the office. And then, so that means that concern was both justified and alleviated based on the changing evidence. And then my third concern, which still is very much in order, is whether he was going to toxify the image of the Republican Party among growing demographic groups in the United States. That one's still very much on the table, and we don't know the answer to that one yet. But when you wrap that all up in a ball, what that suggests is that I'm more likely to vote for him in 2020, because some of my concerns have been alleviated and because circumstances have changed, than I was in 2016. So that's sort of where things are. Okay, I think this is the last one.
Hi, Ben. So there is a study that shows that states with more gun control have less gun deaths, and states that border states with more gun control have less gun deaths. So why do you not believe that this is evidence that gun control saves lives?
Because if you actually look at the correlation between state gun control and the level of gun violence or murder rates probably a better statistic, in those states, it looks like a scatter plot. It doesn't actually look like a direct line. So for example, there are states like New Hampshire and Vermont that have very lax gun controls and very, very low murder rates, because as it turns out, most of the gun violence centers in the United States are big cities. Right? And those also happen to be heavily regulated, most of those big cities, Washington, D.C., Chicago. And so the question of how much gun violence is in a particular state is largely relegated to whether those cities comprise a large percentage of the population, in Illinois, for example, or in Louisiana, where New Orleans comprises a large percentage of the population, has an insanely high murder rate. So if the correlation simply doesn't actually statistically hold. There's a good article in the Washington Post breaking down this data. I'm trying to remember the author of this. I remember tweeting it out at the time, all about looking at this specific argument. It doesn't actually work. So I do not think that gun control is the most effective means of preventing gun violence. I think that the most effective means of preventing gun violence is the same means as preventing all violence, which is establishing better family structure, alleviating poverty, a growth in economic potential. These are the ways that gun violence actually goes down, not taking away guns from folks, particularly law-abiding folks. Okay, this is the last question. All right,
Last
sorry,
question.
one more.
Okay, in response to your statement about where in the Constitution
yes.
is there the abortion right to abortion, I want to ask you the same thing about the Heller decision. Where in the Constitution does it say an individual's right to a gun? It doesn't say that in the Second Amendment.
Okay, what it actually says in the Second Amendment is that a militia being necessary to the preservation of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Right? That's the actual language of the Second Amendment. To understand what you mean by the militia, you have to understand that the militia was a member or a bunch of individuals who would be summoned by the government to serve in that militia. Individual ownership of arms was extraordinarily prevalent in colonial America. Virtually in many societies, in many states in colonial America, the basic assumption is that if you were between the ages of 16 and 50, you were going to own a gun in your home, which is why they could rely on the militia to actually assemble at any given point and go fight. So there was an individual right to bear arms. It is not a modifying or restricting clause. It is an explanatory clause, not the same thing. The clause that matters there is the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The first clause does not say if you're not a member of a militia, you don't need a gun. It's an explanatory clause for why guns are most necessary, the formation of militias to preserve and defend freedom abroad and at home. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Ben Shapiro. Thank you.